Ohio has become a hotspot for data center development. These massive facilities are being proposed across the state, mainly in rural communities, and the response from residents has been anything but quiet. Communities are grappling with questions about water use, pollution, land prices, and who ultimately benefits from these projects. At the same time, state regulators are considering easing rules for the wastewater data centers discharge, raising more environmental concerns. Zaria Johnson reports on the environment for Ideastream Public Media in Cleveland, and she's been closely following the data center debate in Ohio. This is part of a series of interviews with reporters covering data centers around the Great Lakes. Zaria, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
What's driving the interest? Why are developers so focused on Ohio right now?
Yeah, it's partially access to things like large parcels of land, resources. When we think of things like water, land, especially electricity capacity, there are parts of rural Ohio primarily that developers are looking to because that's where they can access those things. But in talking to experts and conducting these interviews for different stories, another piece of the puzzle is that developers can think that these rural communities might not have the political will or the time or the capacity to organize and push back on these projects.
And what has the state done to try to attract these developments?
So there are certain incentives for developers that come to Ohio to implement these data center projects. There could be tax incentives for developers. There could also be agreements between utility providers like public water systems to provide certain amounts of water if they have an excess in capacity for those development projects.
Can you walk me through how the wastewater permits work and what are the proposed changes and what would those changes allow?
Yeah, so the permits basically outline the amount of wastewater that any sort of industry or utility is allowed to discharge directly into streams that could lead to Lake Erie or the Cuyahoga River. It basically outlines a cap on the total amount of wastewater that they're allowed to discharge. And so the proposed changes at the Ohio EPA is to increase the amount of wastewater that data centers in particular are allowed to discharge. And from a regulatory standpoint, the argument is that this would make the permitting process easier for developers so that they can sort of fast track the process and getting their permits approved. But environmental advocates are saying that this is basically threatening water quality and the protection of water quality here in Ohio, especially when we think about the Cuyahoga River, its history, Lake Erie's history of pollution, industrial pollution in particular. There's a big concern there.
Yeah, it seems like the developers have kind of bet that communities won't have the will or the wherewithal to put up much of a fight, but they're losing that bet. What sorts of concerns are people raising at these meetings?
Yeah, the biggest are some of the key environmental concerns. What does this look like for our water quality here in Ohio? What does this look like for our electricity rates here at home? What does this mean for the amount of farmland that we have here in the state to actually produce crops? That's been a big thing that's come up with residents, especially with tariff conversations happening here in the country. If we're going to be using a lot of this farmland to put industry on, then we're going to have to spend more money bringing crops in. But obviously, a couple big concerns are noise pollution and light pollution from these data centers as well. There are residents, especially in Southwest Ohio, who are nearby Virginia, and they're hearing these stories of, data center projects happening elsewhere in the country and the effects of noise pollution and light pollution coming from residents there. And the concern is, how can we protect ourselves from all of these sort of environmental concerns here in Ohio?
Well, Zaria, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Great Lakes Now comes to you from Detroit PBS, which means we rely on viewers like you. To support our work and get more stories from around the Great Lakes, scan the QR code or visit greatlakesnow.org/donate.